Welcome to the University of Nebraska at Omaha Center for Public Affairs Research's Data and Research Series for Community Impact. I hope you're enjoying part 2 with us, but it is only getting better. We have a wonderful panel assembled to talk about creating meaningful data visualization and communications by embracing diverse perspectives and impactful insights. I spent a lot of time doing data viz. I know not everyone does. I think it's more than just data visualization that makes the impact. And so that's why we're really including the term communications here. But we really want to talk about, like, this is not something that works well when done by yourself. This is something I said to the panel that I think might be helpful to set up the framing here. We're going to start with the premise that data visualization and communications are an effective and important tool. So if you go through the trouble of putting data into this format and sharing it with an audience, there's a good chance they're going to trust you, you're going to build credibility with them, and they're going to be interested in what you have to say. And it's at that point, what you have to say and how you put these things together that really make a big difference on what is learned, what we take away. So we really want to be thoughtful about what we present and how we present it. We want to make sure we're inclusive, that the full picture is represented, that we're telling a real story, that we're not misguiding people, either intentionally or not intentionally, because it definitely happens unintentionally sometimes too. And so that we're really focusing on the human elements of data, and that the assumptions and biases that can come in, that you have a set of tools to overcome some of those very common mistakes and pitfalls. And I think this is a place we really want to talk openly, right? I do this a lot, and it is hard. And it is, actually a very recent story. I was presenting for the Nebraska Chamber of Commerce, and someone said, oh, in your focus on some of the economic data, you really didn't include some of the stories of diverse groups. And we really need allies when you're out presenting about these topics. And they were totally right. And it's hard to balance in any one presentation. So I think we want to talk really openly and honestly about the choices we're making when we do make choices in our data viz and communications. And again, some tips and tricks to help us be sure that we're doing it in a way that is respectful and empathetic and sort of embraces the full diversity of the topics we talk about when we talk about demographics as people, and they are diverse. So I'm so excited for this panel. I'm going to learn a lot along with you all. I know that. So briefly want to introduce the panelists, and then I've given them about 15 minutes to present. I think some are PowerPointing, some are going to have awesome things to say and places for us to go think and learn more. I think that's also a really good point. Like, we can't cover it all in a panel, but we're going to try to give you some tools to get out there. Cammy Watkins, Executive Director of Inclusive Communities. I actually moved this panel to part 2 because I needed Cammy to present. So thanks for being here. Miles-Steffens, the Assistant Director of the UNO Juvenile Justice Institute. Carrie Malek-Madani, Director of Marketing and Communications, Nebraska Community Foundation. Correct me if I said it wrong. And then Cristián Doña-Reveco, Ph.D, Associate Professor of Sociology at UNO, and then the Director of the UNO Office of Latino Latin American Studies. Oh yes, thank you for being here, Cristián. So I am going to turn it over to Cammy. So Cammy, thanks for being here.
Yes,
take it away for us.
Missy. All right. Well, so I want to fully start by prefacing and saying I'm the executive director of a nonprofit whose mission is to confront prejudice, bigotry, and discrimination. I am not a data person, like expert. So when I share that, only to say that you don't have to be a data wonk or a really strong data user in order to really recognize how we can better utilize data and then put it into places where it's equitable and inclusive and representative of our community. So as the executive director of Inclusive Communities, we are as with many nonprofits, we're beholden and responsible for sharing out information, but also as part of our work in terms of consulting and working with other organizations and people who in systems and institutions, which is part of our mission, is to really transform institutions to ensure that all identities are equally represented and that we have a just and equitable society. So one of the pieces that I really want to focus my conversation or my presentation on is really going to be around the why we should be identifying in all data sets what our sample sizing is about. And there's a book that I want to offer to everyone as a resource that if you haven't read it or haven't heard of this author, she's a feminist activist, and the book is called Invisible Women, Data Bias in a World Designed for Men. And it's by Caroline Criado Perez, and I'll type that in the chat once I stop talking. But this book really explores how and so I'm telling you this as the background for the language that I'm going to use around the default sample size in the atypical, which is all stemmed from her research and the work that she does around. What we found is that from everything from education to healthcare, we know that data is a crucial part of the policies and practices that are developed. And what her researchers really identified is that in majority of these situations, the default sample size tends to be male and tends to be white. And in that, we leave out a huge swath of our population. If we look at the global population, and her research spans not only in the United States, but globally as well. And when we talk about different ethnicities and races, we should be referring to them as the global majority. The global majority is non-white. So when we consider that the majority of the data and the research that we do and the sample sizes and the studies that we do around healthcare or certain different types of diagnoses, like in particular cancer, I think there's recent research that just came out that said about 800,000 women were diagnosed or received diagnoses that could have been avoided, had better research and better intentional education and screening been done. But because majority of our sample sizes and the studies around different cancers, unless it's the two gynecological ones with cervical cancer and breast cancer, we weren't actually doing enough research to identify the impacts on women. And this book really explores that in all sorts of facets, from the workplace to just our basic city design and transportation, from things as simple as the standard crash test dummy, which most people know about is the average height, weight, and size of a male, and not thinking about the impacts of crashes and safety in vehicles on the average height, weight, size of a female. So something as simple as that to like how we clear the patterns and processes and procedures around clearing snow and thinking about the transportation patterns of women versus the transportation patterns of men, and then designing a city based off of the default sample size or the default population being male and also being white. So just setting that as the basis around this. So if you really want to do a deep dive, if you want to kind of see this research for yourself, I highly encourage you to grab that book on your audio or your audiobook or in your library resources to take that deeper dive into better understanding that kind of background of how I'm sharing with you today. So one of my recommendations really is, and I'm going to share with you an executive summary of the way in which we present some of our data, in the recognition that those word choices that we use, how we decide when we're collecting data from our participants, what we should be offering. And I'm gonna share that really quickly. So here is the executive summary this is our longest running camp program. It's our Inclusivity program. And it has been around, so we've been hosting this program for over 20 years. Now, in the beginning, like, of course, having demographics and about of our aggregate data around our youth that are participating, this is the standard. In the most recent years, we've started adding these qualifiers at the beginning of our data set of who is the population that we're talking to. Now, our organization and our program isn't just centered on certain demographics or certain people other than the age range. And I think too often in data visualization in particular, or even data collection, we don't qualify who is the sample size unless we're specifically looking for anomalies in a particular demographic. And that's what I believe we have to change, because unfortunately, the default is we're assuming that the base understanding of that population is white and male and typically older. In the earlier conversation that Josie was having, I was watching that panel, and there was that discussion about rural versus urban and the necessity to really define that it's urban is considered 5,000 or more, and that population is really a determiner when we look at data and science without defining what we're actually talking about and who really falls in there. We're all going to skew our thought processes to the assumption of, well, if I hear rural, I'm going to think predominantly white, predominantly older, predominantly male. And if I hear urban, I'm going to think predominantly mixed race, predominantly younger, maybe 50-50 male to female. But those demographics aren't always necessarily correct if we make those assumptions. So if we can start to be better about just saying, here is the population, we might have a better opportunity of understanding what some of those anomalies are that come in the data or the inconsistencies that occur throughout. So just giving you an example of what this looks like for us. And I will tell you, we use open self-selection data collection. So when we ask people to identify their demographics, we actually don't have a drop down that says you can only pick from this 5 or 6, because what we found is that people's identities are so varying and vast, and there's so many more categories than what we utilize. And this really came to us as one of my staff people, my former communications manager is Indian descent, but she was raised in Trinidad. So she's from Trinidad and Tobago. In Trinidad, she would identify her race ethnicity as Indo-Caribbean. And no demographic sheets in anywhere that she fills out in the US, now that she's a US citizen, is there ever the opportunity for her to list how she actually truly identifies. So her experiences are lumped in with a group of folks which might be completely opposite and may not be representative of how whatever study that she may participate in. So for those reasons, we actually do leave it open. So in terms of your race, your gender identity, and your sexual orientation and your faith, all of those different qualifiers, when we ask for our study and our participants, it's an open answer question. Now, I know that, yes, as data people, you're probably like, oh my goodness, the amount of time and how much that will take to try, how do you get aggregate answers? How do you do comparison and contrast? Yes, it's hard, but it's not impossible. This was a conversation when we started and we started utilizing the tool that we used to create this report. We had the conversation with our evaluators and we walked through and we identified what are those similar terms, what can be grouped, what should still remain separate. And we were able to come up with these basic blockings, and then they know going forward what the various answers that exist, you're able to still group them so that you can have something that can be compared and contrasted. So I'm going to switch down here, like as you see in our the answers of whatever our youth had said. And this particular report is not statistically significant. We actually have 3 camps a year, but in this one we weren't able to get one of the camps data, and so you're just seeing kind of smaller data set than what we typically would when we're evaluating. But even though we had allowed the youth to fully open and give us theirs, then we pull that together into the common groups, and then the individuals that maybe were outside of that, you do see it listed here as other races. But in terms of if we, I couldn't find the dashboard, and I felt like this would be a group of folks that would love to see. The dashboard that we have is this really beautiful, lots of opportunities for us to bisect and intersect information to really see, to dig down into the data of who is most being impacted, what are folks most saying. All of that, asking those additional questions and ensuring that we have that really helps us better ensure that we have proper impact, but then also the information that we're getting is representative. And something I do want to point out, that while probably looking at something like this is like, oh, well, this is just your program. I'm able to look at this data and know that 62% of the students that go through our program are people of color. That is fairly close to the Omaha Public Schools, which is the largest population of students that we serve. Their data is about 70% of their students are people of color. We also found our data here around 50% of the students in our programming identifying as LGBTQ, and the average age being 16. If we're looking at data nationally, that is on par with the data that 50% of youth today in this generation, Gen Z, identify as LGBTQ community. So we know that the results or the group of people that we're bringing into our program are fairly close to what's on trend nationally. And so when we're looking at to say, is this representative of the youth of today, and is our programming and its impact doing what it's supposed to for the population we're trying to serve, we actually are pretty much on par. We wouldn't know that if we were just basically taking the general information, which would be like, what school did you go to? What grade are you in? To just give that example, we still obviously have that, but you notice in our data visualization and what we share, this comes down later. We want first folks to see these really in-depth demographics. And something I wanted to share also with you, we do also ask the youth. And so in some of our topics or the categories that we ask individuals to share about themselves, it is such an open that our number of answers may be much more broad than our ability to put it into a smaller grouped chunk. So this is where word clouds come in really handy. So we're still able to utilize the data. We get a representation of the various categories or identities in which the youth use, but we also get to see what's emerging as maybe a more consistent response. And so that gives us the ability to have a little bit more of a sense of what are some of those other things that are harder to categorize, but are also going to be crucial to the work in which we're doing and how we're building out our programming. So knowing that several youth outside of their other standard race, gender, sexual orientation, age, demographics also identify as immigrant and neurodivergent. And seeing that increase in those two particular identities has shaped the way that we're able to shift the ways in which we present our programming. One of the things Josie asked me to speak about was thinking about colors. Our colors blocking that we utilize in our presentations and the work that we do for our outreach and programming, we have utilized colorblind scales and ensuring that when we're presenting information, that individuals who might have whatever different spectrum of the colorblindness they can still be able to see the information that we're presenting. That's been really crucial for us because we know that that's a hidden identity, disability that most people don't talk about and is not often recognized, and that individuals, especially if you're trying to color code, if what you're putting is in colors in which someone's a red, green blindness, they're not able to even see the differentiation, as Josie talked about in the previous session, of how important that is to really pull out the data that you're trying to share. So being cognizant of the colors that you're using, and that's an easy Google search or other visual learners and websites around colorblindness that you can just access. What are those colors that would be best utilized for individuals who may have colorblindness? In terms of language, I talked a little bit about that. I know there's a lot more usage of the term BIPOC, which is Black, Indigenous, and People of Color, when we're talking about the full spectrum of individuals that are non-white. I think, especially if you have a smaller sample sizes, and you do need to combine your individuals that are non-white, it's best to say non-white and white. I think often we get so caught up in not wanting to define the default or universal population, which is white, but we need to, because we know that as the demographics are shifting, the global majority, especially if you're doing global or you're comparing your data and your analysis to around the world, we have to acknowledge that the global majority is non-white. And if our default research is only predominantly white and male, and also the global majority is majority female, we're not doing a service in terms of what we're sharing. And what we're doing is potentially creating harm in terms of who's going to use our data to create policies and procedures that are going to go forward and design cities, workplaces, and school systems.
I'm really interested in your research. When I know you're doing research or evaluation or working with a population, and you care enough to find out everything about them, to understand multiple identities, to say, here are the identities and here is how I'm comfortable describing them. And here's how they describe themselves, right? I'm not wondering if you're the best resource on this group of people. I know you're the best resource on this group of people because you have respect for showing that information. And I think it just comes across so well. And I think so many of us are out there, and there are a lot of times I am talking about demographic groups that I do not represent. I may not be the best person then in that case to talk about that group, but like even in workforce topics, right? I'm not in finance. Can I talk about the finance industry? Yeah, I can talk about the finance industry because I have respect for what that means. Or I'm going to learn a lot about it before I go out and talk about it. I'm not just going to talk about it on a surface level or from my own perspective. I'm going to find a way to talk about that identity from a place of understanding or knowing or learning from that group of people. I'm doing a lot of research right now on entrepreneurship. I'm not an entrepreneur, but I want to hear from entrepreneurs about what their experience is. And I want to have a lot of respect for that's different than mine and learn about it.
Well, and I think it's important to, dive in, because, and that's part of, I think, it may be some of the fear, but it also may be some of the hesitation that we have of, well, is it, we might be violating certain ethics if I'm asking these certain specific questions about demographics. There are not ethical violations in asking, if you're doing research, to ask for the demographics. And too often, when we are having issues, especially around disparities in healthcare and education, in prison and incarceration, we cannot pinpoint where the disparities happen because not enough researchers are identifying the demographics of their population size in all aspects. So that is so crucial, because if we're trying to solve problems through data, we have to actually get all of the information that's necessary to solve the problem.
I think that is so true, on a point well made with this group of people, right? We're opening up avenues, not closing things down, by learning more about the differences in our society. Cammy, thank you. We're going to do more Q&A at the end. I always have lots of questions for you as well. But right now, we're going to turn it over to Monica Miles-Steffens. Monica, we just presented together as part of a juvenile justice conference. And I thought Monica just really embodied this topic of data communications really well as sort of that empathy for the group. If you're going to talk about a group in society, we need to know that you really understand them. And I thought Monica did both really well. So I wanted her to come today and share with us. Thanks for being here, Monica.
Well, thank you. And I appreciate, Josie and I had a great time presenting. And I will say I'm by no means a complete expert on this topic, but it's one that's really interested me since years ago when I first started working in the juvenile justice space. And I was out in rural Nebraska, and this is not a slight against rural Nebraska because I grew up in rural Nebraska, but I was out presenting about an exciting new program we were starting at the organization I was with at the time. And I was talking to a group of county commissioners, and I got done, and one of them stood up and said, I don't know why we have to spend money on all this youth stuff. They just need to get taken out behind the barn and given a good whooping like my dad did me. And I was like, whoa, wait a minute. So I've always been really interested in trying to understand, how do we connect the dots, right, between the good work that we do and the message that we want to share with other people about the work that we do. So I think, especially right now, like Josie said, I work for the Juvenile Justice Institute. And so this is primarily more around some of the youth research that we've looked into. And all of the information from this presentation comes from two sources that are at the end of this presentation. One is called the Frameworks Institute, and they have amazing resources and about any kind of social justice topic that you're trying to message to audiences about. And then the Annie Casey Foundation has a toolkit specifically around messaging juvenile justice reform. So that's where some of this research comes from. And in the justice space, we've really been lucky to have kind of a time leading up to now that people are really interested in reform. There's been a lot of work around reform, but I also see the pendulum shifting a little bit back to a little more the public not understanding, stakeholders or policymakers not understanding the connection between what we know in research that works and what some of those still lingering punishment-oriented kind of attitudes are. So how do we message the work that we do with the data that we have, but also with the messages that resonate with communities, and how do we shape our data and our messages around that? So there was a study done back in February through May of 2021 by Fenton and the Harris poll. And what I appreciated about this particular study is that it was people around the country, representing all over the country, 18 years or older. Over 50% of the people were people of color that responded to this poll. And they were asking their perceptions, their public opinions of what do they think about juvenile justice and what works in juvenile justice. And so, interestingly enough, there is an overall sense that crime has increased and public safety in the U.S. is getting worse. But I know, like, when we look at the data that Josie and CPAR and the census and lots of other places put out, we know that that's not necessarily the case, and that arrests are going down. Youth arrests have plummeted in the last 20 years. And then 6 out of 10 people actually believe that public safety was the same in their own communities, but it was worse elsewhere. So it just goes to show that we're really battling what people experience in their day-to-day life versus what they're seeing and hearing from those messages that they get on. Mostly the general public gets their messages and understanding from the news and lots of crime shows on TV, right? And so there's that disconnect. Many people believe that the juvenile justice system is considered broken. The overall sentiment is that kids who enter the juvenile justice system often end up in the criminal justice system, and more than half believe that it needs reform. So that's really positive, something we can build on, right? Because that's what a lot of us are working on, is how do we make it better? How do we do things that have better outcomes for the people that we serve, whether in or trying to prevent people from going into the justice systems? Also, lots of people are starting to understand that race is a key driver of these inequities, that Black, Latino, Native American youth are treated differently than white youth in the system, and that it seems to be unfair, and that people have not really witnessed any change, which they're frustrated about, that we haven't seen any change in how these populations are served. One, though, interesting thing is kind of this tension around people in the United States still see a significant disagreement on who should be responsible. Many Americans fault families and low-income communities rather than the juvenile justice system as a whole. So again, kind of going back to some of those historical, systemic, what we know about what drives these inequities, people are still tend to lean towards it's an individual issue versus the systemic issue, which can pose challenges or things that we need to be aware of when we're presenting and messaging data to our stakeholders. There's also a belief that youth can change, but they need real rehabilitation and consequences. So this is positive, right? That people do believe that there is hope for youth. And the other thing is there's a general aversion towards doing nothing. So I know in the juvenile justice space, a lot of the research centers around we do more harm when we over supervise or kind of widen the net and engage youth in the system. But that's the evidence-based work that we talk about, but that doesn't necessarily resonate with the general public because they want to hear about accountability. It was also interesting that in these in this research that restorative justice and diversion are new ideas to many, even in the informed public, even though we know that diversion has been around for a very long time and restorative justice has been around for a very long time, although it's really kind of recently emerging as something that people are interested in the system. So it's just really important to understand that people believe that these things are maybe beneficial, but they're hesitant because they feel like maybe they're too soft or maybe work for lesser crimes, but wouldn't work for more violent or serious crimes. And a lot of people are skeptical that these processes can actually help mitigate racial inequalities, even though the research that's coming out about diversion, particularly restorative justice type diversionary programs in schools, is really, really promising about reducing inequity. So I think it's really important to also think about consequences remain a really important part of the narrative for a lot of people in the general public. They want an approach that is focused on rehabilitation, but there's a strong belief that people who commit crimes need to have consequences. And so I think we a lot of times use consequences, accountability, those terms interchangeably, but we need to be really clear that what consequences look like and how that actually impacts public safety, that sometimes consequences are providing supports and counseling and those types of things that we know work, and that when people receive those types of supports, public safety is enhanced, and making that different message. Here are some areas where even in the work JJI that we've done, in what the research says, where messages can go wrong. I bet a lot of you have shown up to meetings with like Cammy's infographic and narrative is so amazing, right? And we show up to meetings with our great information, and then the message just somehow it goes wrong, right? Like we just start talking and people aren't understanding, or they ask questions and take us in a different direction. So a few tips from these resources where to think about where messages can go wrong are that a lot of times we make assumptions about what people know or understand, about the systems that we work in every day and our program. Even sometimes your own boards or statewide advisory groups or things like that, we make assumptions about maybe what they know. So be sure to be really clear and simple in how we're talking about things. Make sure you're defining things, staying away from really highly technical language, jargon, acronyms. I used to work in probation administration, and one day our administrator stood up and said a whole sentence in acronyms. And the crazy thing is we all knew exactly what she meant, but anybody outside of the system would have had no idea what she was talking about. So it's really important to be careful about knowing your audience and be mindful of those terms. Sometimes we go too big and too broad and we get too much information in front of people. This is feedback that we've been working on at JJI. We often put together really large annual reports because we're giving information about 250 programs around the state. And people have said it's a little too big, it's a little too overwhelming. So we're really trying to break it down and put it in smaller chunks of information for people to understand. And the last piece is language. We have the opportunity to really change the narrative for people in the general public, for our stakeholders, for our policymakers, when we use the language that we want people to know works. So for example, we've moved away from, even though it's called the juvenile justice system, we rarely use the word juvenile or offender in the narratives that we produce. We use youth or person who caused harm, right? And instead of sanctions, we talk about opportunities for development or opportunities for growth. So those are types of ways that we can help very subtly change the narrative and help people understand and humanize the individuals that we work with, rather than them just being a number on a page. So what are some ways we can build a strong message for the audience that we're talking to? Oops. The first is actually to identify your audience. Like Cammy's infographic was a great example. Depending on who you are going to visit with, you may just cut and paste and even simplify that document a little bit more, right? If it's a community group versus your county board or a statewide advisory group or the legislature, The legislature is a great example. People often tell us they're really hesitant to go testify because they don't even know it's too nervous. They don't know what to say. And you do only get 3 minutes, right? So you have to be really succinct and know what your audience is looking for. The main thing really where you can connect with your audience is identifying what values do you share with that group of people. So if we're talking about people and policymakers who want to see consequences or accountability, I think we all know that that is a piece of the justice system, right? There has to be accountability. So you can lead with that narrative around, here's what accountability can look like. Here's what our data shows, how we've held people accountable and the positive outcomes that we've had. Less recidivism, more people going to work, those kinds of things that people can value and that help explain safety. Talk about what your common sense practical goals are. And then I really think this is important think about who your messengers are. You don't always have to be the messenger for your program. Maybe it's one of your volunteers. Maybe it's one of your board members that has a connection to that group. Maybe it's one of your consumers, one of the people that you've served that are able to provide that message. And that message may not always have to be in person. It could be through a story that's written, through a video. There's lots of ways to help get that point across. Then you want to make sure you know what you're asking or that you want them to know, right? So we will keep things in short, concise descriptions, in relatable language, so that people can understand, that it's a positive, inspirational tone, really demonstrating that impact in your outcomes. So this is why I'm so grateful that Josie and CPAR do these kinds of webinars and education, so that we know why entering that data every day, even though it's not our favorite thing to do, is really important, and that evaluation of our program, because that's where we can really speak to our outcomes. And then keep things really simple, a clear, simple call to action, that you just want them to go to your website and learn more about your program, if that's your ask. Or if you're wanting financial support, what does that look like and what value would that bring to your program? Or maybe you're asking for volunteers for mentoring or something like that. So the main thing, and I think Cammy did a great job of this, just tagging on that, is how to develop your story. So you want some key pieces of data. If you noticed in Cammy's infographic, they had some bubbles with some key little quotes or stories that fit the situation, and leave them with some very clearly developed takeaways. Whether that's a 1 to 2 minute elevator speech, a 1-page handout, your fact sheets, message cards, those kinds of things that you can leave with people that they can come back to, that have your contact information on them, so they can reach back out to you when they want to get more information later. So when we put this all together, basically we're saying we have to frame the issue. What common ground and values do you share with your audience? What are those 2 to 3 key data points and a brief story? And what are you offering as the solution? What is your expertise from you or your agency? And what your clear call to action is for that group. So here are the resources that I told you about earlier. You'll have access to those, and we can have any questions.
Thank you, Monica. I think you bring up so many great points about positionality, and data viz isn't really just about us as the creators, it's about who we are speaking to. And I think that's so important, on any given day, on any topic, as you noted in juvenile justice, but on any topic, there's a good chance who you're presenting to doesn't see the issues the same way you do. So it's a lot of work to get people on the same page, even before you can start giving them all the evidence. Right. So that is all really helpful and going to be available. Right now, I think this is a great time to turn it over to Carrie from the Nebraska Community Foundation. Carrie, you should tell people what you were doing this morning, because I think that's a really good example of data communication.
Yes. I was on Pure. Well, Josie, you were also on Pure Nebraska this morning, but
I haven't seen it. Was it terrible? Sorry.
I had to come live this morning, but yes. And like Cammy, I am not a data person. I am a communications person. I am great at strategizing how to get the data out to the folks that we want to see it. But Josie and the wonderful folks that she works with, we depend on them a lot to make sure that it's good, reliable data that we share with people. So as Josie mentioned, I work at Nebraska Community Foundation, which is a statewide organization. We work with rural communities all across the state. So we have like 1,500 volunteers that we work with, all in their, we call them affiliated funds. They're basically local community foundations all across the state in about 250 communities. So people attraction is really a top priority of the organization. We are very interested and invested in figuring out what are the things that it would take for a young person to either remain in their rural hometown or return there in the future. Thus, we thought that this was a good thing that was worthy of studying. And so for the past 4 years, we've actually been partnering with the Center for Public Affairs Research and working very closely with Josie to work with our affiliated funds and local schools to survey middle and mostly high school students about, what do they really think about the places that they call home, and just their perceptions and perspectives of those places. And so we've now surveyed over the past 4 years, like 3,700 students. It's been about 1,000 students per year. And again, all across the state in small communities of varying sizes all across the state. But I have to say, we have been honestly pretty shocked at what we've discovered through this research. So I'll just go ahead and share my screen here. I'm just going to give you a brief look at the Josie, can you just let me know you all can see the report, right?
Looks great.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So this is a report that we put out every year that we conduct this survey, which again has been the last 4. And I will certainly provide the link to this so you all can look at it. But this has really been kind of the piece, the outward facing piece that we put together each year. We always announce this kind of right in August around the time that kids are going back to school. And so this kind of thing is sort of top of mind. I'm just going to scroll through here. I hope I don't make anyone dizzy, but we do, of course, take some demographic data. I'll touch on that a little bit. But, these are some of the questions that we're asking about plans after high school and things like that, plans for the future, what career do you see yourself working in, all of that good stuff. Some of the things that we really make a point of lifting up. So for the last 4 years, consistently, students that we survey tell us that they prefer small towns. They would prefer that the ideal size of a community to live in is small, like my hometown. And again, this is, I think when we started this, this work, not necessarily what we thought we would find. They want to remain in Nebraska. So the majority actually report they're extremely or somewhat likely to live in the area they live now. And I surprisingly, again, the 3 things that they say are the most important when choosing the place that they want to live in the future are safety, good schools, and proximity to family. So these are things that I said this morning on Pure Nebraska. As an elder millennial, I cannot really relate to this because can say with a bit of certainty that I don't think my peers would have said safety, good schools, and proximity to family were the things that they were most looking for in the place that they called home in the future. So I guess I just want to lift up too that, given the topic that we're talking about today and just working with Josie and kind of what the key themes we wanted to lift up when we were talking about this to different audiences, is that the demographic data that we collected, we definitely noticed some patterns, that there were discrepancies in how white and non-students were answering the questions. Gender came into play. We discovered as a result of these surveys that in general, non-white students didn't feel as positively about their rural hometowns as their white counterparts. We learned that female students were a little bit less likely to return to their hometowns in the future than were their male counterparts. So I guess we kind of combined that because with some of the more qualitative responses that we were getting back, and discovered that welcoming and belonging were things that we were seeing students talk about over and over and over again in their written responses. And that really became one of the big themes that we lifted up, and especially in connection to safety, that, we need to make sure that since there's this huge desire for safety, that is something that all students feel like they can find in Greater Nebraska. And again, the results didn't really point to that. So in our communication strategy, that was a huge talking point to what we lifted up. And I guess I'll just go a little bit. So you all saw the report. We really worked to eventize this launch more so than we have even in the past few years. We actually held kind of a virtual launch where we had speakers like Josie. We had the director of the Department of Economic Development, Casey Baylitz, on hand to talk about this. And that virtual announcement proved to be a really great way to kind of kick this off and just show that, this is data that people should be paying attention to, because it's really integral to the future of rural places across the state. I'm sorry, Josie, I know I need to wrap things up here.
You're fine. I just wanted to come on and talk to you.
Oh, okay, perfect.
You're no rush.
Okay, sounds good. Of course, we did all kinds of media opportunities and things like that. Like Josie mentioned, we continue to do those because these youth survey results have really been integrated just into how we talk about our organization. This is a point that we just bring up all of the time, and why the work that we do, I guess, is reinforced by the evidence that we discovered through this survey process. So I'll kind of leave it at that. I want to make sure that Cristián has plenty of time to speak as well.
I do want to lift up a couple things. One, you are a fabulous data communicator. And as you were saying, like the events and the follow-up and the press, I think there is this tendency with research to drop it. Like, here's some research. You got it. You have it. It's on the website, right? And it's really not enough to communicate these main messages. And, both good and bad, right? Like, we want to share this information. And so you're really talented at that. And so if anybody has questions about like what that sort of campaign around data looks like, much more so than like the data viz I do, Carrie's a great resource. Then most people we're talking to right now are not as lucky as I am to have sort of this built-in data set ready and available for me. And so like Nebraska Community Foundation, they usually are either creating data or working with a set of data they have. And so I think it's another really great example of sort of making the data what you want. Like, we could have asked a standard set of questions that we could have easily compared back to like a census source or something like that to say, here's how it fits in. But that wasn't the point of it. So we asked some off the wall questions because that's what we want to know. And so I think that's another cool opportunity. But then the point about different groups in youth reflecting on the questions really differently, right? The overarching story is a really positive one. And I've never wanted that to get suppressed. There's a really positive story. Rural youth feel positive about their communities, and that should not get overlooked. But that's not how all rural youth feel. And it is easy to, the majority of students say, and move on. But I think, especially with you, Carrie, we have both really kind of pushed, like, there's an undercurrent here. It's not all students, but there's something happening here. And that's a lot of work too, because it's not what the average student says. It's not the bulk of students, right? And so finding those and being sure we feel comfortable knowing what's really true and sharing that message alongside a really positive story, I think it's kind of easy to jump. Like, okay, it looks pretty good, but we've been really careful to say, and also you should know.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think we've this year more than ever kind of framed that as a call to action. So the people that are, exactly, there's something to celebrate here, but there's also some things that we really have to investigate further. And many, many, many of the rural communities that we work with, demographics are shifting in major, major ways. This is something we have to be paying attention to. If you want to create a welcoming community where folks feel like they belong, then you've got to listen to these young people they represent the future, the next generation of the Nebraskans that will call these places home.
Absolutely. And I think that is a great opportunity to turn it over to Cristián. Hi, Cristián. Thanks for being with us.
Hello, everyone. My name is Cristián Doña. I'm the director of the Office of Latino, Latin American Studies at UNO. And what I'm going to talk about is one part of what we do at OLLAS. But since most of you likely do not know what we are and what we do, I want to spend a couple of seconds introducing the office. We're turning 20 this year. OLLAS was founded in 2003. And we work in general to provide a place for Latinos and non-Latinos to learn about the Latino community and about Latin America in general. Now, there's three areas that we work on and three main ideas for each area. One main idea for each area. First, we have a major and a minor. We prepare students to thrive in what, as Carrie said very well, it is going to be a changing demographic environment. Two, we promote and showcase culture, Latino and Latin American culture. We have a biennial art exhibition that is coming next fall. And this year we're finishing today with Cinemateca, our festival of Latino Latin American films. And three, we use research to serve Omaha's Latino community. The picture that you have on your right, it comes from a study on the amount of Latino studies program in the U.S. And as you can see, we are the only ones in this area. There's a good program that does research in Missouri, Columbia, but they don't do teaching, right? So we are the only one in the region that does these three things. Now, our research is community engaged research, right? So we don't, we serve the community in helping them with what is not available for them. Our objective is to provide Omaha, Nebraska's Latino community and community organizations with up-to-date scientific data that can assist them in understanding the challenges and opportunities Latinos confront as a community. Now, this doesn't mean that we don't work with non-Latinos. It means that our research is about Latinos in Nebraska and in Omaha, right? It is community engaged because we partner with local stakeholders and community organizations, either to gather data together, and I'm going to show an example later on, but also to respond to their needs in terms of data analysis. So I'm going to get a call or an email saying, Cristián, we need to learn more about Latinos in this context, and I'll use either CPAR data or census data to respond to that for the community, whatever it is. Yeah, but one of the key aspects, or one of our key missions in this context, is to democratize access to information. Right, as you all know, and you've seen in these panels, the amount of information that it's available for us out there, it is significant, and not all people can read that information in order to understand it, right? Because people are not prepared in their academic background or their work background to actually engage with this kind of data. So our goal is to democratize access to information, and we do it in basically three ways. The first is that we publish reports. These are they're not academic reports. Their language is written for the community, although we might have some issues in the language from now and then. But these are written in a way that anyone in the community would be able to understand them, right? But it is they're long, and it is somewhat a higher level because it has a significant number of data of tables, for example, or graphs, and it might get in the way of time, among other things, right? We published 23 of this research reports so far. Now, in March of 2018, we began publishing a blog, right? And the blog had to be connected to this reports, but also to other things happening with Latinos or with Latin America, right? They're not the only way, but blogs, we think about them as a way of continuing to democratize access to information, right? In your left-hand side, you have our screenshot of our page for blogs. It's a dedicated page, and the two others are blogs written from research reports that we've done, right? And for example, one of the goals of the blogs, and that's what I asked the people that are working on this blog, is to have only one graphic, nothing else, one graphic, right? Which is the somewhat opposite of an infographic, because with just one graphic, the argument is prepared to revolve around that simple or that graphic and nothing else. In the case of the one in the middle, is about the impact of immigrant spending in the community. So the less than 1,000 words of that blog revolves around that specific topic. If you like it, if you want to read more, the report, the executive summary of the report is available. The other, the same, one graphic that came out of a research on the impact of COVID on Latino-owned businesses we did a couple of years ago. The other, and this is something that for me as a sociologist is very important, is that we need to weigh narratives with numbers, or numbers with narratives, however you want to call it. I was asked to present to the Latino Economic Development Committee Council. I always forget what the C stands for. Earlier this year, and I had data from multiple sources, right? And one of the things that I've been thinking about is how we present COVID data, right? COVID-related data, because the numbers might be not only overwhelming, but it's easy to get lost in those numbers that are, thousands of people. Earlier in COVID, in 2020, we started doing oral histories with community leaders about the impact of COVID in community organizations. So we've been working on that. We've been, analyzing that data. And this quote, the quote at the top right, it comes from that research. Okay? And Cristina Castro-Mantukevich stated at some point, right, that the impact COVID was going to be more significant for Latino community than others, right? And she says, this crisis has set us back enormously. And then we pair that, or I pair that when I'm talking about this data with actual numbers from COVID. And one of the main numbers that I use, and you can see the graph, you can see it's a traditional way of measuring by 100,000 people, but look at the second bullet point on the left-hand side, right? It talks about age of those who died, right? The lowest average age of those who died, Latinos have the lowest average age of those who died, 65 years. And whites who have died, 78%, their average age is 78 years. Right? So we see that there is a significant difference there, and that connects to the idea that the crisis has set us back enormously. Right? So why it's important to weave the numbers with narratives, or the numbers with narratives? Because in that way, we ground the data on things that are more relevant, or that give a face to data that might not have seen in the past, right? So that's why we want to bring the narratives and connect it to data. Now, we're not doing mixed research methods or mixed methods research here. But because we're not seeing this from the starting point, but what we're doing is we're using a significant amount of data sources that we have in order to present it to our stakeholders or people in the community. OES itself, but it's our research area, comes from, or has its soul, if you wish, on the Latino Latin American position that think that both research and education should be for the community, right? We should be in the community, talking to the community, because that is the only way that that data, that information can be used by the community to transform themselves, right? To become members of a larger U.S. community, right? To be able to organize themselves, to be able to a community organization, to be able to talk to others with a data perspective. We're using data, right? Central to this argument of to use knowledge as a transformational power is, as I mentioned, democratize data access, and that's our goal always. To do this, we prepare multiple ways of presenting data, and that's what I tried to show you. Some example of how we present data in multiple ways, so that it reaches different audiences and democratize access to data. But not only numbers, narratives. Narratives are important. Interviews are relevant. That can converse or that can relate or discuss with numbers at the same time. Now, we have at OES 2 data visualization pages, one on political participation, the other one in demography of Latinos in the state. Those have been those are way old, and we haven't worked on them yet, in part because they are somewhat static on the way that they talk about the numbers, right? It is, yes, you can go and access that and get an idea, but you don't know the story behind the numbers. And in order to do that, a future project that we have is actually think more of those pages and the data we have as a digital humanities project. So digital humanities, what has been doing is bringing all the richness of the humanities into websites, right? As a way that yes, you can go into a census or data page and see and download the data for the ACS, the American Community Survey, right? We're looking to do something similar with qualitative data, right? So we're connecting this to sources of data that should never be apart. Thank you.
Thank you, Cristián. I think you brought this conversation back really full circle, right? Without the research you're doing, we would be in the same predicament Cammy was talking about, right? We're not researching the people that are actually in this community. So we're bringing light to a whole new issue that might have really gotten overlooked, because Omaha, while it is definitely becoming a more diverse place, is still fairly white. And so we could miss a whole richness. So I'm going to ask you each, maybe in the order you presented, numbers or narrative. If you can only present one, which one are you going with? Numbers or narrative? Cammy?
So I'm going, for me, I'm like, it depends. There's no answer. I would say if I have to, like, a choice, narrative is where I'm going to go, majority narrative.
Monica?
I have to ditto that. Yeah.
Carrie?
Yeah, I'm communications person, narrative all the way.
Cristián?
I'm actually going to go with what Monica presented. It depends on the audience.
You have to pick one. Okay, and I mean, I think that's a good point too. But if you really did have to pick one,
yeah, narrative, because as someone wrote in the chat, numbers need context. Numbers need grounding.
And right, I think everyone here was talking about people as part of what we research, and so like maybe a microbiologist doesn't want narrative in their communications, but right, we do. And I think that adds such a level of richness to the stories we tell. And I think it's it should be a big takeaway from the series. We do this series because we are affiliated with the United States Census Bureau, and we want to make sure you have access to the best available data on a wide range of topics. But so often people are like, do you have data on? I don't, but you do, right? Like all of you out there in the world are doing work on behalf of individuals, and you have data. And I think so often, instead of sort of looking for the answer, you all have data. And even if it's just a great story about how you help someone, right? Like, that's data. And as it looks from the chat and from our panelists, it might be better data than anything I can help you with anyway. So, Carrie, I think this year especially, like, some of the comments were like, okay, like, this has to come out, right? Like, it's not, you don't see it big, but like, if it's there at all, or Cristián, like, one death, right, is a way bigger story than the average rate of people, in some group, right? Like, it matters. So I think you all make a good point, but I mean, I'm still here for some quantitative information from time to time. It does help. It's really helpful in reframing. So I think another big tip that came away from this group is to know your audience when you're presenting. So again, because we don't have a ton of time, in just a couple of words, sort of your individual best practice for knowing your audience. Like, how do you figure out what's the best way to communicate with a particular group or stakeholder?
Yeah, I can start in and I think I'll just kind of reiterate what I said, and even in our data collection, is allow them to define who they are. Because our assumptions or us trying to force them into the boxes that make it easy for us to determine their category does not give us the opportunity to make sure that we're actually providing the information that they need. So allow your audience to define who they are and then build your information based on that.
I'm wrong all the time. And like, until I can admit that, I can't go out and figure out how to be right. I don't know what people. Monica?
Yeah, I would kind of build on that and just to say, learn about them, right? So you may know who they are when you may have relationships, but if you have no relationship with that audience and you're kind of going in cold, like, do your research, figure out what their vision, mission, values, those kinds of things are, so that you can try to make that connection.
Yeah, I think absolutely relationships are key. One of our key audiences with the information we're putting out on youth surveys are the volunteers that we work with across the state, because ultimately they're the change makers that are using this information for good. So yes, cover page of Omaha World Herald is great. And, I get excited about that, but it's about getting it into the hands of our volunteers, because they're really the ones that are doing amazing things with the data.
Sean?
So I agree. Just doing some research on who we're talking to. As is Hispanic Heritage Month, I'm asked usually to give talks to different groups. Last week I did one. I gave a talk in a lawyer's office, and yesterday in an insurance company. Right, two completely different audiences, and I thought, yeah, that's easy. I have the same presentation for all. Doesn't matter. No. When I did the first one, I knew what they expected from me. So what I did in that presentation, I talked about more qualitative data, more identity issues, right? But then I was thinking, it's like, I cannot do that for the other group, even if it's as interesting as presenting quotes, right? They like numbers, right? So that's what I did. I turn it around, use more census, and frame it from that perspective, and it worked. There has been other times that it hasn't worked at all, but in this last couple of weeks, it worked. So yeah, knowing who you're talking to, doing research on their websites, even in this case, meeting with the person, because it's usually the person that asked me is a DI person in that company. So let's talk. What do you want? What do you want your audience to learn? Who is your audience? So yeah, thank you.
And I think people think, right, if I create a visualization here, this is the visualization. There are so many ways to visualize it. There's so many ways to do it. I probably am now giving well over 30 presentations a year. I might mix and match some slides, but like pretty much I'm changing things every time. So this idea that it is static or there's one best way to share this data, it's just not true, right? Like there is no rule book on this one. And it really does take the willingness to adapt to different audiences to be able to make an impact, be super effective. So that we're about close on time. I want to thank this group of panelists so much. You have been wonderful. There is just so much more that we could learn from you all, and hopefully we'll have you back another time to go into more depth on this one in particular. I want to thank you all for attending and hanging out with us today. All of the materials will be available on the website, and we look forward to seeing some of you in part 3. If not, be checking out our website, as we are always trying to get the data out there. Thanks so much. Bye, panelists. Thank you.